Hey, greetings. Welcome to week 7. This is lecture 1. So this week we're going to take a look at more of an expansive vision of, again, what it looks like to take seriously the swath of land called your neighborhood, and how do we understand our posture towards and engagement within the context of our neighborhoods. We're going to spend some time talking about that and some questions that we can ask and some practical steps that we can take. But before we do that, I want this first lecture to focus on the writing of your sermon. I've had some questions about writing sermons for those of you who are not accustomed to doing that very often. What are the steps we take? And because I'm asking for a manuscript, not just an outline, I'm asking for a full manuscript of a sermon that you would preach in your congregation based upon the information that we've had in this class and how it relates to helping your congregation understand neighboring better. So you've done the hard work, right? You've done the exegesis. I think with the exception of just a couple people, I've graded those. But the hard work is the work that we do with the text. Now understand, when you go to write a sermon, not every bit of what you've done in your exegesis will end up in the sermon. The exegesis is the means by which we come to understand the text in a more deep and rich and textured manner. All of your sermon will be informed by that information that you mined out during your exegesis, but it might not show up in your sermon in the way that you might anticipate it would. So here's a couple thoughts for you as you go to write a sermon. One, going to write a sermon, you recognize that you're not just simply communicating information. You're inviting the congregation into an encounter with the text that you've been working with, trusting that the story of the text can shape, form, and transform people's postures and understandings in the world in which we live. Now understand that every preacher preaches the principled approach from time to time. The principled approach is we take a text, we pull out the 3 or 4 principles that we find meaningful in the text, and we give them the principles, and sort of the story itself gets short shrift. But I want to encourage you to really, as you're working with your text in the sermon itself, to do the hard work of really engaging the text itself. So instead of just hoping that we can deal with some stuff on the front so we can get to the 3 main points that we want to make, keep coming back to the story. Help the people understand why the story matters. So there's a few steps that I take, okay? So one, I want to identify I actually draw a picture of a house on the paper that I'm working with. And I talk in terms of how do we get people home? Like, what is the home moment? How do I know when people have arrived somewhere in the sermon that I'm preaching and that I'm writing for them to hear? Like, what experience, what encounter, what moment, what is the takeaway? Now, too often pastors don't ask that question when they write sermons. And so what ends up happening is they take what's called the shotgun approach. They just kind of shoot out a bunch of information and hope something like the pellets in a shotgun blast would land somewhere, right? But I think the better approach is to understand the streamline, the straight line, the one shot that we have to land this moment, this thought, this movement of the sermon, to land it somewhere and to bring them home. So I draw a picture of a house, and after I've done all my exegesis, I draw a picture and I say, okay, where do I want to land? What will happen that I'll know that we've arrived in the place? What is the objective? What's the point? I once heard a friend of mine who said the difference between white preaching and black preaching is that white preaching will put you in a car and drive you to the house. It'll drive up right in front of the house. It'll show you, point at the house, and then it'll drive on right past. He said, black preaching, he'll pull you up in the car. He'll get out of the car. He'll open up your door. He'll take you to the front door and kick open the front door, and he'll take you in the house. And I always want to find a way to take people in the house. How do I know that we've reached the objective for the sermon? And you've got to name that so that you know where you're heading for your sermon. Then I start to think about, what's my hook? How am I getting into this message? You only got about 30 seconds to a minute and a half to grab people's attention. So I find myself often writing sermons in such a way that I don't just tell them what I'm about to say. I start in the midst of a story or the story of Scripture itself. So if I was preaching a sermon in which I was focusing on the exile in Babylon, I might start with something like, "There they stood, gathered around the fire, the flames from the community fire flickering on their faces, the dancing of the shadows." And one looked and he could see the tear rolling down the corner of the eye. I want to invite people into a moment, into an encounter where they start to lean in to their seats and really start to get a sense of where are we going, because that's scripture, right? It's an invitation into a story that we believe has the capacity to change a life. So you want to start something on the front end that pulls them in, that draws them in. And that hook needs to be consistent with the home. So I call that process actually the hook to the home. Like how do we engage people, and then where do we want them to land? And then I pick the route. Generally, I write sermons in what I call moves. 3, 4, 5 moves, depending on the sermon length. So in a 20-minute sermon, I may make 4 moves. On a 25-minute sermon, I may make 5 moves. And those moves can be anything like setting the situation, naming the complication, pointing towards the resolution, and then moving us towards celebration. The moves could be naming what is the trouble in the text and bringing that and connecting that with the trouble in the world, and then naming the grace in the text, and then leading us to grace in the world. You could do a three move where it's a thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So you name the sort of a thesis from the move, from the message or from the story. Then you kind of shape the antithesis. What is problematic about that, and then you bring it to the synthesis at the end, where you sort of bring those things together and land them somewhere. There's a number of different mediums you can use, but really you're asking the question: what's the route that I choose to get them there? Because if I pick the wrong route, I won't land them at home. If I start trailing out and I don't keep the objective of where we're headed to always in mind, there's a good chance I'm going to land somewhere that I didn't intend to land. And that's not always helpful for people that are trying to listen to me. So I want to move in a way that is consistent with the flow of the sermon. And then I just want to have fun in the story itself. I want to pull out from the story this wealth of possibility of allowing people to have, and I use this language a lot when I teach biblical hermeneutics. I believe the Bible has a way of shaping an alternative consciousness for us in this world, that we are prone to be absorbed in the status quo, the way things are and the way things we're told should be. But I believe the scripture has a way of inviting us into what I would call an alternative consciousness, a different way of seeing, being, and living in this world. And your invitation to the congregation who's listening to you preach is an invitation into that alternative consciousness. And you do that by way of story. And yes, you can relate things, pull things out, point at things, and name things from the story that are principles that we need to draw from. But what I want to caution you from doing is just telling a little bit about the story on the front end, and then moving to your 3 great points that you want to make, and then doing a full discourse on each of the 3 points. I want to invite you to take a trail through the story, continue to call them back to the story, invite them to see their worlds through the lens of this story in a brand new way. So if you're using the story of the Good Samaritan, keep pulling them back in to the narrative arc of this story, and in helping them to see their world in light of what is being relayed in this story. And then one of the last pieces I would want to suggest to you when you're writing a sermon is that you want to make sure and name God in the world. You want to make sure that you make that connection between the world of the text and the world in which people live. And there's a lot of creative ways to do that, but inviting them to consider, what would this look like? What would this story look like walking around in 21st century shoes? And I think, again, that's a really important part of the sermon writing process. So again, let me sort of summarize here. You've got your text and you've already done your exegesis. You've done the hard work. Now the fun part is how am I going to communicate this text that I've worked hard in to the congregation that I'm going to be preaching it to, inviting them to consider this text in light of the hopes of what it looks like to be a Christian neighbor. you figure out where you're home, what's your destination, what's your objective, where are you going to land. Then you begin to name how are we going to set off on this journey? How am I going to grab people on the front end? And then what is the method? What is the means? What is the medium? What is the route that we're going to take to try to get there? And I want to keep drawing them back into the story, letting the story do the work for me. It needs to do the heavy lifting from the message itself. And then continually helping them to understand this story that was spoken long ago continues to bear relevance in 21st century shoes, continuing to name God in the world. And so you're gonna write that sermon, and you're gonna invite people into an encounter and engagement with the text of Scripture that will shape their understandings of Christian neighboring in a way that is transformative in ways that you could not be just by yourself. And so I want to encourage you to take a look at that as you work on your sermon for this week.